The sound of my body hitting the floor at Christmas dinner wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence that swallowed the room after I hit the hardwood, a silence heavy enough to break a bone. My name is Simona Cunningham. I'm 29. I work in corporate compliance, numbers, rules, quiet punishments that add up over time. I live in a third-floor walk-up on the east side of the city that still smells faintly like my father's pipe tobacco. I tell stories for people who think they have to be loud to be heard. For most of my life, I thought I knew the shape of shame. That night taught me it had corners I hadn't seen. Before I ask you to do the thing everyone asks on YouTube, hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from, let me take you back to that house, that smell, that table. I want you to see it the way I saw it for decades. A place that held memories like ornaments, some polished and bright, some sharp enough to cut. Our house used to hum in a particular way. Morning sunlight came through stained glass in the front door and painted the hallway in color. My father built the house with his own hands between contracts and chemo sessions, nailing boards and promises into place. He kept a workshop in the garage where the radio always played jazz, low and steady. After he died, the house got quieter, like a record with a scratch in the middle, and that's when Frank showed up. Frank Morrison came dressed like someone who had stepped out of an ad for tasteful watches and leased SUVs. He smiled at the church widow support group with the ease of a man who'd practiced sympathy in a mirror. He brought casseroles and compliments, and a pair of work gloves that had never seen a wrench. My mother was 36 when she met him. She'd been alone for 2 years. She was soft in a way grief makes you, wide open to anything that called itself a rescue. At first, he was everything we could have wanted. He took us out to dinner. He offered to help with the mortgage. He brought a winter coat for my mother she had never been able to afford after my father's medical bill. He kissed her hand in public, and for a while my mother smiled again, like someone learning to breathe after a long dive. But habits show you faster than charm. Little things shifted slowly, like a light bulb burning out. He started choosing which family photos were hung and which were boxed. He called my accomplishments practical and Brittany's passion projects. He bought my stepsister a brand new car on her 18th birthday and handed me a list of budget workshop. When I asked why, he said things like, "Some people need a push to be independent." He said it in a voice that meant something else. You don't deserve help, you must earn it. Those small, tender cruelties were the foundation of a larger archetype. By the time I was 24, the company my father had built, a modest logistics firm that put food on our table and paid contractors on time, was something Frank sat in and rearranged like a man designing his personal empire. He wasn't just charming, he was strategic. Names on titles changed quietly, signatures appeared on deeds like ghostly handwriting, and bank statements began to whisper a different story. Christmas had always been our loudest ritual. Matching sweaters nobody liked, plates stacked 3 deep, 23 people leaning on worn chairs, the house full until the seams strained. My father's chair at the head of the table had a carved detail he liked, a small oak crest he called Simona's throne, when I was little and climbed up to be the queen of mashed potatoes. After he died, I kept one of his sweaters folded in my closet like a map to a better time. The first Christmas Frank attended, he sat in my father's chair and laughed as if he'd invented the holidays. The day of the push, the house smelled like pine and cinnamon and 1,000 casseroles. Frank had been drinking since noon, the kind of slow, deliberate sipping that loosens tongues and hides claws. He made comments all evening, jokes that weren't jokes, about who earned their seat and who inherited it. He kept patting the back of my chair like someone testing a claim on a throne. At 7:47 p.m., which I remember because I was staring at the grandfather clock to avoid watching him, Brittany arrived 2 hours. She rifled in designer bags like a pirate counting spoils and lit the room with a kind of entitlement that looks like Frank's face changed, not just pleased, but lit. It was a look I recognized later as predatory warmth. He stood, walked over to my chair, and announced to everyone, loud enough for the television camera in the living room to pick up if any of our neighbors had been inclined toward dramatic, that his real daughter had a proper place at the table now. The phrase, real daughter, was a landmine he'd been carrying all night. When I didn't move fast enough, he grabbed my chair, not the seat, the chair itself, and yanked. I rose, caught in the tablecloth. Napkins flew like confetti. Cranberry sauce arced and landed on my grandmother's vintage dress. My hip hit hardwood. The world narrowed to the sound of cartilage and the thud of chino. For a terrifying second, the only thing I could hear was my own breath and the tinny hum of the fridge in the background. And then the silence. 23 people, including my mother, sat like statues. My grandmother gave a small choked gasp, less a reaction than a reflex placed neatly by a lifetime of keeping the peace. Uncle Ted pointed his phone and filmed, eyes bright with social currents. My mother's expression was an expert's mask. She could unsee anything she wanted. She'd done it before. Frank leaned down and said, loud enough for the cousins to chuckle and my humiliation to be the evening's entertainment, "This seat is for my real daughter. Get out." There are moments where time slices itself into two, before and after. That push was one of them. I left that night with my dignity folded in my hands and a quiet, dangerous something else intact. The knowledge that Frank leaves his phone unlocked, face up on the kitchen counter, was smug. I had seen it earlier, a careless narcissist's habit. In that single flash of careless, a trail opened. I'm a compliance officer. I collect patterns for a living. I notice the things other people smooth over. The next morning, I sat on my couch, ice on the bruise forming along my hip, and opened a folder that used to live below my father's desk. The one my grandmother had slipped to me in the kitchen, the previous Thanksgiving, with hands that trembled and a whisper that smelled like clove. Don't let Frank know you have this. The folder had been sealed with staples and inside were invoices, old emails, property deeds with names crossed out and replaced with his, bank transfers with memo lines that meant nothing until you knew to ask. There were also things that made my hands shake. A copy of a will, the real will, one my father had hidden with a lawyer in another state, that put the business and the house in a trust until I turned 30, with distributions beginning at 25. That will didn't match the papers we'd been shown during probate. It didn't match the quiet way the house had been put into Frank's name. On Frank's phone, the one he left unlocked like an exhibit, there were messages to men with nicknames and bank accounts, and late-night receipts for things that didn't fit with a man who claimed he just wanted to provide. Brittany owed tens of thousands to people with names like Big Tony and Vegas Mike. Frank texted a guy named Carl about moving assets. There were spreadsheets with numbers that traced like a river toward Shell Company, transfers that smelled like laundry. You begin to see the shape of a life when the ledgers line up. I could have gone to the police. I could have gone to my mother and said, "Look, but my father once told me that to undo a thief, you must move like a compliance officer, quietly with evidence and timing." So I began to prepare. My father, in other words, taught me how to practice justice carefully. Late that night, I sat in the dim light of my childhood room, laptop on my knees, scheduling emails like timed explosive. I sent copies of the discrepancy to the state's attorney general, to the IRS tip line, to Frank's business partner with subject lines that did not mince word. I sent a dossier to Brittany's creditors with ledgers and proof of payment. I sent my mother a single file labeled, I attached the original will. When we talk about revenge, we often imagine fire and vitriol. What I did was administrative. It was paperwork and patience and the leverage of truth. I wrote emails that were calm and professional. I attached receipts. I included screen grabs. I let the law and cold facts do the burning. At 6:23 a.m. on Christmas morning, my phone lit up like a Christmas. Frank's business partners were calling. His phone, which I could hear through the thin walls because he lived 3 floors above me in the same building he had convinced my mother to buy, began to ring in earnest. He typed my name in the family group in all caps and then tried to delete it when the responses started flooding in. Uncle Ted's video, the very one he'd posted with a laughing emoji, had gone viral. Someone on TikTok had found it, and the court of public opinion had assembled. I did not expect the onslaught to be instantaneous. I didn't know some of the dominoes in front of me. An op-ed feed, a former employee who'd been paid off, a woman who recognized Frank's face from a book club in another state. But the first crack was loud enough. By midday, phone calls had turned into sirens. I watched the thing I had set in motion bewitchingly efficient. It felt like my father was there, tapping a stopwatch. Then Frank did the thing people who are guilty. He fought back. He hired a lawyer who wore a smile that cost more than my rent and spun a story about a vengeful stepdaughter, about hairline ethical violation wrapped as criminal activity. He called me a saboteur. He sued me for corporate espionage. He accused me of forging documents with enough theatrical flourish that some small portion of the public started to believe the lie. It was a sharp, horrifying pivot. One day you're the victim, the next, the villain. The press likes a villain, even when the facts are messy. Frank's lawyer filed motion. Brittany hired a documentary filmmaker to capture her truth as she wept on camera in my hallway. The internet, that fickle courtroom, began to spin a false narrative. This, I learned, is also part of how monsters survive. They make noise. They drown truth with a louder lie. They hire people who make you look like the crazy one. I slept badly. Sleep had never been restful after what happened that night. The world became a series of waiting rooms, legal, public, personal. My employer put me on administrative leave while they investigated. People I had spoken to for years asked question marks. Even my mother, under pressure and gaslit by a man who had been her safety for so long, called and asked, in a small, uncertain voice, if I had planted evidence. The worst part of being right is the loneliness that comes when you have to prove it to the people you love. It burns in your chest, a small, bitter heat. At the hearing, Frank's lawyer was slick. He produced witnesses who'd been paid in hush money. He slithered around facts like they were puddles to step over. He tried to paint me as a woman's scorn. He nearly worked. He was good at what he did. But there are things your opponents cannot foresee. There is stubbornness that comes from grief and love and the right kind of loyalty. Remember the folder my grandmother handed me? There were more pieces tucked into it. Things people don't stack under their bed if they don't expect to. There were recordings my father had made in the last months of his life, things he could not say in public because he was dying, and because evidence must be incremental. A week before the hearing, my father showed up again in my life in the form of a video file marked with his handwriting. He sat in his study, thinner, stronger in his words than his failing body. "Simona," he said into the grain of old wood, "if you're watching this, it means the world tried to push you down. Don't let it win." He talked about a trust in Denver, a lawyer named Mitchell who had the original, an FBI contact he'd been quietly feeding details to, an agent named Sarah who didn't miss pattern. My father had long suspected Frank. He had hired someone to look into him before the cancer took more of his time. He'd built a trap. Not with violence, but with legal scaffold. Accounts seeded with traceable money, contacts hidden in plain sight, a network of ex-widows who had been wronged and were waiting for bodies to match their My father had loved me enough to plan for the moment when Frank might decide to take everything. When the FBI showed up the morning of December 30th with an affidavit and a warrant, I remember the way the air felt like an exhale. They moved with the quiet thunder of inevitability. Frank was arrested in his underwear before his retainer finished a sentence. Brittany screamed. Doug, the PR guy, tried to negotiate with an agent who had no interest in his spreadsheet of lies. The court that day felt cinematic in the way only a very real form of justice does. Raw, messy, human, efficient. Dorothy, a quiet paralegal who had been collecting recordings and whose daughter had been victimized by the same man years ago, walked in with a hard drive and a conscience. She'd been recording meetings when she realized the stake. Her color-coded transcripts were a kind of poetry to prosecute. Kelly and Marcus, two former coworkers who'd been offered money to testify against, turned on Frank when the FBI explained perjury and federal consequences. They flipped like cards. The thing people forget about justice is that it's built from small acts. A recorded conversation, a notarized will, a timestamp, a person with the courage to say, "This is wrong." It is tedious and it is glorious. Frank's empire collapsed under the weight of its own construction. The man who had pushed me down at a table was being led out in handcuffs while the cameras whirred and the bystanders finally had word. The charges stacked up like concrete blocks: fraud, racketeering, tax evasion, witness tampering. The judge froze assets. The trust my father had created with an immovable lock clicked into place. The house, the company, the protections all folded toward me like a map closing on the right address. There were moments after the collapse that felt like an inhale of new air. My mother, raw and sober from a week of therapy and time with my grandmother, came to me one night and said, "I was sleepwalking for so long. You should have had a mother who fought for you. I'm sorry I didn't." People say forgiveness is a one-time thing, but it is actually slow, like paint drying on a new wall. She didn't ask me to forget. She sat with me and told me how afraid she had been, of being alone, of financial ruin, of admitting she'd been wrong about a man she loved. She had to relearn who she was. The courtroom became not just a place of punitive measures, but a small cathedral of truth. Brittany, who had been taught to act first and think later, thought later and decided to flip. She told the truth, not because she had a moral revelation, necessarily, but because when the net tightens and the consequences loom, many people choose the lighter sentence. Her testimony was raw and small and also devastating. The woman who'd sat in pantry light and filmed sob stories for likes turned state's witness. It is a strange thing to see someone you despise become the key to freedom. The sentence was heavy. Frank pleaded guilty to enough charges that the judge had little to do but count the year. 25 years felt like an enormous number until you realized the cost of currying with widows and lying had rotted decades of lives. He wasn't just going to be absent at holiday dinner. He'd be absent in the way the law makes sure predators are absent. And what does one do with the aftermath? In my case, the company's employees, honest people who had been squeezed by a bad leader, came back. Contracts were. We instituted profit sharing and a culture that matched my father's values, not Frank's. The house, once a monument to grief, was sold, and my mother chose a smaller place by the sea. She started wearing red again. Mitchell, the quiet Denver lawyer who had held my father's trust like a promise, became a friend and later something. He asked my mother's permission before proposing. I gave it without drama because she deserved a partner who asked the question and meant it. We started a nonprofit with women who had been deceived and ruined by predators like Frank. We called it the Simona Foundation, which made me laugh in the way you do when a thing is too big to hold without making. It helps widows understand how to trace assets, how to spot the signs, and how to protect the ones they love the way my father tried to protect ours. The most ordinary moment after all of it was New Year's at grandmother's house. The table was full in a way that felt like rested. People who had watched in silence the year before now brought casseroles and apology. Uncle Ted, who had started the chain reaction and then regretted it, paid off half the fees he'd made from clips, and used the rest to buy me a blue car that runs because karma sometimes pays for gas. My mother stood at the center of the room and raised her glass. "We failed Simona once," she said slowly. "We will not fail her again." That silence after was not emptiness, it was repair. There is a particular photograph I like to. It is of the Christmas table before the push. My father's carved chair visible at the head, the place settings laid like promises. A bronze plaque at one place says, half joking, "Simona's throne." After everything, I printed a new copy of that photograph and carried it to the visitation room at the Federal Detention Center when I visited him once, not to seek closure or mercy, but to give him the image of what he had taken and what he had tried to erase. When I handed him that photo, he looked at it like a man finally seeing the consequence of his small, repeated cruelty. He tried to. His mouth made the shapes of sentences like a bell tolling. I had nothing to say that would make it better or worse. I put the photo down on the table in front of him and walked out. There is a point where mercy is a thin thing you can choose to give or withhold. I had chosen, that day, to withhold it like a shield until the lessons were learned. So why tell you all this? Because when someone pushes you down, it can feel like the end of a line, the closing of a door. But for me, it was the beginning of a ledger being balanced. Justice is not swift. It is not always glorious. It often looks like paperwork and late nights and tiny acts of courage. It looks like an old man recording instructions for the daughter he loves. It looks like a grandmother. It looks like a network of women who decide they are tired of being quiet. If you're watching this and have been pushed down by someone who collects people like trophies, please know two things. First, you are not alone. Second, paper matters. Start a file. Keep receipts. Speak to someone who can help you record things. The battle for truth is less about dramatic speeches and more about methodical patience. There is a last line my father left me that I keep for mornings when the world still smells like coffee and possibility. He said, "Justice isn't revenge, it's balance. Restore the balance." I have worked to make his words true, not by learning to hate, but by learning to act with precision and mercy when it's possible. The last time we sat at that Christmas table, the room was warmer. There were people in it who hadn't been there before. Women from the victim's network, a quiet FBI agent to become my friend, my mother's new husband holding her hand like a steadying thing. Brittany did not come. She had begun to build a life that did not include our family yet, community service, a real job, a small, ordinary ritual of showing up. That, I was told later, felt like a mercy. And Frank, he is serving time. He was stripped of the things he took and left with the truth he had hidden. He will have a long time to think about what he did and perhaps the cost of a single push. He once told me with a smug arrogance that made him think he had the floor forever, that he had given me everything I'd needed to hardship, motivation, a reason to fight. He miscalculated. The thing he forgot was that some people inherit more than possession. They inherit a history and a stubbornness that can't be bought. If you remember one image when this video ends, remember the sound of the room after I hit the floor? Not because it was the worst sound, but because it was the one that told me where the fault lines. Remember that silence made me do something. It made me open a folder. It made me learn the patient work of truth. And in the end, truth is louder than every carefully curated lie. Thank you for listening to my story. If this moved you, please subscribe, hit like, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I read that. Share your worst family dinner story if you're brave. I promise you, if this taught me anything, it's that telling the story is how the work begins. And one last thing, if anyone ever tells you your place is anything but where you choose to sit, stand up. Even if it means bringing